Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw,
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So, the Unjerked podcast is affiliated with B. McGraw's website.
which is the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
And unlike your website, instead of making satirical journal articles, we look at real journal articles to talk about issues that are often discussed quite often on Reddit and Twitter and other. It's mostly Reddit and Twitter, really. But basically, we look at those topics and see what's really going on. So this episode, we're going to talk about transportation, both public transportation as well as just transportation in general. So I do see this. So there's there's a couple communities on Reddit that discuss this. So there's r slash
There's F cars, right?
yeah. There's that, and then there's the F cars circle jerk.
Oh, I love that one.
And then there's a couple YouTube communities. There's one that I'm not going to say the name of the channel because the guy who runs it is like kind of
Is he litigious?
not litigious, but he has a very strong fan base and is like he's like all up in the Reddit comments on like his own subreddit.
Oh my gosh.
He's like
name
really,
him anyway. See what
really
happens.
he's really into like cycling and stuff, but approaches it from a very negative perspective. So,
Has he thrown a smoothie at a car that got too close?
I don't think so. No.
I
will be honest, though, when I see like a peloton of cyclists riding by wearing like skin tight neon green, it is a little cringy. So anyways,
this is the future they want.
Anyways, so we talked a little bit about some of the subcultures. You don't really see. I mean, that's basically it. A lot of people criticizing the U.S. for having bad, not having high speed rail, I guess.
Yeah, and on top of that, like, we have some cities with good light rail. I mean, my city doesn't have good light rail, but I still am able to use it, and I don't know, it's just a car-based society.
Doesn't your city have a tram system that goes from like downtown to other areas?
Yeah, we have a tram system. Yeah, light rail. I do take it to work the days that I go into the office, and it works pretty well, but only because I live very close to a station, and there are not a lot of stations.
Yeah. So anyways, we'll start with an international perspective, as we often do. So there is this report from, it is called the Advancing Public Transport Statistics Brief. So you go here, and if you go to page 4, there's a graph that talks about the journeys per capita on public transit by country for a couple select countries. So at the very top, and this is annual journeys, so this is per year. So at the very top is Japan. They have 246 public transit trips per year. So that'd be, that's probably an average because people in rural areas probably don't use public transit, but that averages out to more than once a day for each weekday, because there's, I don't know about, so, and then Germany is 177, and then the sort of European countries, the lowest is Italy at 128, and then Turkey, Russia, Brazil, China, etc., is 123 down to 108. Spain, which I guess is a European country, so that's 99. So that's on the low end, and then the U.S. is down at 40. So
pretty low.
The U.S. has very, very low. I'd be interested to see how the U.S. compares to Canada and New Zealand, because those places also are more sort of suburban than European countries are, but they don't have those in this graph, so it's hard to tell. And then the modal distribution in terms of the actual mode of transport used. In the case of public transit, it's 63% bus, 16% metro, 5% tram / light rail, and then 16% suburban rail. Metro, tram, suburban, it's kind of the sort of terminology gets kind of confusing. We'll talk about it a little later.
Yeah, I don't know what the differences between all those
So
are.
suburban rail is literally rail that goes to different suburbs, you know. So
Ah,
if you have like a main city in the middle, you'll have trains that go to like the outlying cities.
oh yeah, that's kind of what we have.
Yeah. And then you have metro, which can mean a couple things. I think the classic idea of here it says considering that there is another mode, commuter railway, which serves suburban areas and goes beyond areas covered by heavy rail. We clustered heavy rail as metro and commuter rail as suburban railway. So there you go. So heavy rail and light
Okay.
rail. I mean, heavy rail is wider cars that fit more people, and light rail is the opposite. That's why it's called light rail because the cars are physically lighter because they're narrower. Um,
Uh,
so heavy rail can carry more people per car, and so the question is, well, why have light rail at all? And the answer is light rail is less capital intensive. You can, the equipment you need to use light rail is a lot cheaper to build, and you can have,
I imagine light rail can go on roads as
yeah.
well.
So light rail can be built at grade on the street. So a tram or a streetcar is literally light rail, but it's on the street. So there, it's like,
When I was in Budapest the other day, they had a lot of light rail.
yeah,
It's really good.
yeah. And then suburban rail, we already talked about. So heavy rail. So heavy rail can also be a lot of things. So in New York City, you have the subways where you have heavy rail underground, but the subways also you also have above ground for the same train system. And so when you
Hmm.
go into the outer boroughs in New York City, you start seeing above grade rail. So the heavy rail cars are on tracks that are above the streets, and then if you go really far out, they're at grade, not on the street, but they'll be on the ground level, next to the streets,
Hmm.
basically. And so that's all about land use. The more expensive the land is, the more you put it below grade. And then if it's a little less expensive, you put it above grade. And then if the land is super cheap, you'll put the tracks on the land, because the more expensive the land is, the more rents you can get from, housing or from retail. And so it makes more sense to put the rail somewhere else.
Yeah,
But
that all tracks.
yeah, putting rail below ground is very, very expensive, but it's worth it if the land value is high. Above grade is also expensive, but less so. And then at grade is the least expensive. So, anyways, there's that. And then there's another thing from Statista, and that's link 2. So, this says who's riding public transit, and it takes a look at different countries, and it says share of people who take public transit on their commute to work, school, university. So South Korea is at 41%, and then it goes all the way down for the Asian European countries. It goes all the way down to 23% for France, and then down to 13% for the U.S. So I would say the U.S. is definitely lower, but I think it's not accurate to. I think the perception you see when reading Reddit comments is that like in Europe, 95% of people are using public transit, and that's just not true.
Yeah, I thought there was going to be more of a disparity. Also, I didn't think the U.S. would be as high as 13%.
Well, so if you combine, so LA County and the New York metro area combined are like 10% of the entire U.S. population.
Wow.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, I don't think that many people in LA use public
they
transit
don't.
on their day
But
to
the point
day.
I'm making is like if you look at very large metro areas in the U.S. have very large populations. So
True.
I
Hmm.
think that's something a lot of people underestimate. Like for example, the New York metro area probably has like 13 million people. I should probably look this up. Um,
Man, that's a lot.
yeah, New
And
York.
basically, if you live in New York, I don't know why you wouldn't take public transit to work.
Yes, it says the New York metro area has a population of 23.5 million people, but that also includes parts of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. That being said,
Wow.
23.5 million people, and Wyoming is like 500,000 people, something like that. So the New York metro area is 40 times bigger than a state, Wyoming, in terms of population.
Wow.
And then if you look at link three, so link three is a map from Our World in Data, and it says share of urban populations with convenient access to public transit. And the US is at 58.9%. Canada's at 73%, which is quite high. All of Europe is very high, 90 plus percent.
Well, they say this is urban population, so
Yeah.
that at least makes it a little nicer.
But even at the urban level, the US has much less accessible public transit than many other developed countries. The story changes when you get to places like most of Africa, not all of Africa, most of the Middle East, and then parts of Latin America. Although parts of Latin America actually have pretty good public transit. Chile and Brazil seem to have pretty good public transit. And then apparently Australia and New Zealand have good transit too. So,
Chile's always the outlier.
yeah. So this is all very interesting. Next, we're going to talk about basically how does rail specifically work? Because I think most of this episode is going to be about cars versus buses versus rail. There's like other things, but they're not really that interesting to me. So when it comes to, and I don't have citations for most of this because this is a lot of just like sort of basic knowledge type stuff. But in Europe, so for most countries, the government owns the actual rails that the cars run on. And then usually there's a government owned rail service. And then additionally, usually there are private services, privately owned companies that are also allowed to run services on the government owned tracks. And so it's sort of like a public owns the government owns the commons type model. And then you can either have a government's option or you can have a private option for the actual cars. And the there's no single like European Union system. You know, there is standardization. I think the actual width of the rails is common across most of the continent, but it's not like there's a single the European Union rail car or whatever. Like that's not really how it works.
Yeah, there was probably some meeting a long time ago in the 19th century where they're deciding that. But I remember that's a thing that comes up in some history books I'll read. Oh, that came up in the book I was just reading when the Russians were trying to connect to the Chinese networks like pre-World War II, and they had to like do a lot of complicated things just to get them to connect.
Yeah. And then
they all had different standards.
In the case of Japan, which is also kind of famous for its rail system, so they used to have a government-owned system called JR, which is like Japan Rail, I think. But I think in the early 2000s, or maybe it was earlier, but in the past couple decades, they basically privatized all of their rail.
Huh.
So JR was spun off into a couple different private companies, which I think trade on their stock market, and they're based off of region. So there's JR East, JR West, et cetera, et cetera. But they're quite highly regulated in terms of, how they operate and everything. So it's not like a laissez-faire thing. They're quite tightly regulated. But this is sort of, you see a similar thing in utilities where in some cities, utilities in the U.S. are owned by the city itself, and in some cities, there's a private company that runs the utilities, but it's tightly controlled by the government. So that's kind of how Japan.
Yeah, like because you have to have like your certain power and frequency, so you don't blow electronics, and yeah.
So Japan has like their main sort of each region has the JR system, which is privately owned. And then you also, interestingly, have separate rails that are or separate systems that are also separate private companies that also kind of overlap. So
do the companies own the cars and the rail, or just the cars?
They own both.
Huh.
And interestingly, a lot of the companies are also involved in real estate from the perspective of the stations. There's this Urbanist article, but it basically talks about how a lot of rail operators basically became real estate developers by basically capturing the value of the stations that they're on. And so the stations in Japan are kind of like retail centers that have a lot of different shops and stores and things like that. They're almost like malls. Obviously not like where the actual platform is, but once you leave the platform, there's like a lot of stuff going on. And
Oh,
so they can collect rents from the businesses that are in the station. And so they actually make revenue through that as well. And then the American system of rail. So America actually has a lot of rail, but it's freight. And the U.S. actually developed a lot of rail in the 19th century. That was actually like their version of like the Silicon Valley boom, was building tons and tons of railroad.
oh, we were all about it.
Yeah, and it was all privately owned, and it was almost all freight, and it's still kind of like that in terms of you have a couple companies that own a bunch of rail, and it's used to move stuff around. And Amtrak, other than certain parts of the Northeast, most of Amtrak operates on privately owned rails. Amtrak itself is like a quasi-public entity, so it's not a government agency, but it's basically created through an act of Congress and is sort of like a quasi, kind of operates as a corporation, but kind of exists at the pleasure of the government, basically, kind of like Fannie
Oh,
Mae and Freddie
interesting.
Mac. So
Huh.
you have quasi-public cars operating on private rails. In my opinion, it's not really a great system, in my opinion, because basically
Yeah.
the commons are owned by private interests, whereas the sort of public thing, which is the cars, have to operate at the pleasure of the privately owned rails.
So they get the short end of the stick all the way up and down.
Yeah. So another big difference. So the speed at which construction happens is actually quite different between the U.S. and other areas. So there's this website, Center for Transportation, and they talk about why why things take longer and why they cost more. And it's a pretty extensive report, but it talks about a couple things like governance. The public institutions charged with leading the delivery of transit projects needs authority, staff, and good governance to move forward. So very often a problem. So in Europe, there's the European Union has guidelines on like this is how you do development for transit projects or for any projects for that matter. And basically, there's a lot of authority given to agencies to get things done. And I think a lot of times, like the Department of Transportation in the U.S., it's mostly kind of like a funding. They'll like give funds and grants to different states, and they'll like give out guidelines and stuff. But it's not like an agency that just says like we're going to do this. Let's just do it. It's not really like that. So there's a lot more. It's a lot more patchworked in the U.S. Also, there's a lot of issues with project management, with consultants who get paid a lot of money, but seemingly not a lot seems to get done. A lot of process issues, a lot of things like that really make building take a long, long time. So that
What if there was like a tech bro revolutionary who reinvented subways underneath cities?
Yeah, that was kind of funny when he was like, "Well, what if we build tunnels underground to move people?" Dang, that's such a good idea.
If anyone's not picking up on this, we're making fun of Elon Musk's boring company.
So, a brief overview of different methods. So, flying, I feel like there's not much to talk about there. There is like the deregulation versus regulation aspect of it. So, before so Jimmy Carter deregulated the industry. Before that, basically, flying was a lot more expensive, but it was perhaps arguably better quality. And once deregulation happened, basically it became a more competitive market where
What were
competition
the regulations that were stopping it from
in
the
terms of like
competition?
how many, in terms of like which routes an airline would have, and like, how many flights it could have and things of that nature. I think now, like,
Oh,
as long as there's space at a particular airport and the airport gives the go ahead, like basically you could just fly there. Um,
hmm.
Whereas there's more regulation around like routes and frequency and things like that. So it's interesting how everyone seems to hate flying and hate airlines, but also they vote with their dollars towards the worst service that happens to be the cheapest. I mean, that's just,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, yeah, that's just how people operate. Is yeah. I mean, like I'll fly Spirit and Frontier because it's like, yeah, it's a definitely objectively worse service. But if you're just hopping from one city or another in a
yeah.
1 to 2 hour flight, like
And then get
I'm gonna
outraged,
pay $50 versus two hundred
and then get
dollars.
outraged when you don't find a charger on the back of the seat in front of you. Um,
You know what you're getting into. You to know what you're getting into on those flights.
and then, and then there's the airport is the one place where I have seen public meltdowns, because I don't see those two times in my life. I think two times in my life I've seen a public meltdown. One was at a convenience store, and one was at an airport where a guy tried to. It's a long story, but basically he was
We saw one on a Frontier flight last time we were flying where the stewardess asked the guy to turn his phone off, which, I've never seen anyone actually tell you to turn your phone off these days. And the guy didn't do it. And, and she kicked him off the flight.
dang.
We suspect racism was involved.
Wow. All right, so ferries. So ferries are useful to cross. Like if there's a city where there's like a river that goes down the middle of the city, obviously a ferry is a useful way to kind of cross the river. But they're not actually that viable for long distance travel. Like if you want to go from
Oh, yeah.
Seattle to LA or from Miami to New York, ferries just cost way more money and they take way longer. I think they're even um, slower than driving. I think. I mean, almost certainly they're slower than driving
I
because
bet.
ships.
Yeah, boats are really slow.
Yeah, boats are quite slow. Um, Actually, I think the water speed record is like one of the deadliest speed records to break, because you basically have these
Oh,
like,
yeah, I've seen videos of those things. Yeah,
yeah,
it
it's
looks crazy.
yeah, yeah. So long distance water travel is just not really viable. I mean, that's why it doesn't really exist anymore unless you're like going on a cruise or something
Unless
like
you
that.
are a crate. Yeah, it's only really good for freight.
Yeah, freight. Well, you can. It's just a matter of like you can carry so much stuff on one giant cargo ship, and also time is not as critical, because if you kind of plan out your supply chains right, you can kind of time out like when things show up, and so time doesn't matter as much for moving supplies basically.
Yeah, you can wait another week for that Timu package.
Yeah. And then gondolas and air trams and stuff, it's like it's helpful if you're going up and down a hill. So if you're in a really hilly city, it might be useful, but otherwise it's like kind of a niche thing. So those things, it's like, okay, I'm not going to talk about it any longer for the rest of the episode, because I think there's not much to talk about really.
I think if gondolas counted, 100% of Coloradians take public transit each year.
Yeah, I mean, at ski resorts, I guess.
Yeah,
So really, this
way
is
too niche.
yeah. So
Yep.
this is really about rail versus road versus human powered movement. So I already talked about the different types of rail. So there's I didn't talk about high speed rail. I mean, it's basically rail but faster. And then you have heavy rail, and then you have light rail / trams, and then you have monorails. So monorails are basically niche. So they do not work at street level, and they don't work underground, because basically the bottom of the monorail wraps around the rail. So there's a single rail, and basically the bottom of the car has to wrap around the single rail, because if it doesn't wrap around, then it'll just fall off. And so,
I've never seen a monorail outside of Roller Coaster Tycoon.
yeah.
Where did they exist?
So, well, Seattle has a monorail, and then a lot of airports, or I guess like Disney World or whatever, they'll have like monorails. But basically, they're super, super expensive, and the only benefit is that they're not as wide. And so, if you're in a space constrained place above grade, then it could be useful. But basically, they're kind of a niche form of transit that is mostly not really like there's really no reason to have monorail in almost every circumstance. So,
Okay, how much more expensive is high speed rail?
uh, compared to what?
I guess normal rail.
I don't know. But high speed rail is mostly regional. It's from moving from city to city.
Yeah.
Whereas other forms of rail are mostly moving internal to a city, basically, or maybe from like a city to its suburbs. And then road, there's cars and buses, pretty self explanatory. Human powered, there's cycling, walking, and then there's like, electric scooters or whatever.
Oh, those are real popular.
Yeah. So the sweet spot depends on distance. So if you're moving from region to region, and this is based off of time, cost, etc., right? So for interregional, I mean, flying is by far the superior option. And then for regional travel, like, let's say hypothetically moving from Dallas to Houston, high speed rail would probably work better, although there is no high speed rail there.
Mm-hmm.
And then internal to a city, the ferries, the gondolas, heavy rail, light rail, buses, cars, etc. And then moving internal to your neighborhood, it would be cycling, scooters, walking. So really, each mode of transit is kind of fit for purpose based off of distance, and the interesting thing about the U.S. is that even though there's certain distances where certain forms of travel would be adequate or preferable, a lot of times you don't see it. So that's something interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So the pros and cons of each method, like I said, it depends on cost, and that there's also externalities there, and then there's time, and then there's comfort. So comfort would be, the weather. Riding a bike is not great if it's snowing outside, for example. And then
That's right.
another thing, and I think this is honest, like other passengers, if you're like in a bus and there's just like a crazy guy in there screaming at everyone, obviously that's not
Well,
great.
also, and this is something I'm learning this year, as I used to be able to walk to work, but now I have to take the train into town. I have been getting sick way more often.
Interesting. I guess that's from other people.
And it's just, yeah, because you're on a train with a bunch of other people and it gets packed in there.
Yeah.
It's like having a toddler.
So next we're going to talk about the actual direct comparison of different modes of travel in terms of cost. So there's a very interesting paper that was published in 2009, and the link is here, and it's called A Cost Comparison of Transportation Modes. But basically, I kind of looked at that, and they didn't include flying, so I just kind of found a different source for flying. So for flying, I found this thing called The Geography of Transport Systems, and this article was written by, who was it written by? So the editor of this paper, or of this website, is Dr. Rodriguez from Professor of Maritime Business Administration at Texas A&M University Galveston. So anyways, he looks at the operating costs of airliners, and it's about 12 cents per seat mile. So basically,
Oh, wow.
yeah. And then,
But you do end up, a lot of times you end up traveling more miles than you need to when you're on a plane, because it's like, well, I got to go to point A to point B, but I got to go through these two cities to get there.
right. And then,
But that's still not going to be that much.
yeah.
more
And
expensive.
then it looks, and then the separate paper, the cost comparison of transportation modes. Okay. So this is by Patrick Condon. But basically, they looked at the operating costs. He looked at a couple costs. He looked at externalities. He looked at capital expenditure. But for operating costs, so interestingly enough, rail is actually quite a bit higher per passenger mile. So passenger mile or passenger kilometer is the metric. So it's how much money does it cost per passenger per mile, or per passenger per kilometer.
Do
So
they? Okay, okay, but this is per passenger. So, like on a Toyota Prius, do you like if you're driving it by
yeah, it
yourself? Do
varies.
you multiply that number
It,
by 4 or something?
well, it would actually be lower if you had passengers because it's the same cost, but split between more people.
Oh, so that is the cost with one person in the car.
I'd have to look in the paper to see what metric he used in terms of number of people. But basically, according to this, the I'm trying to think. So Toyota Prius 12 cents per passenger mile, Ford Explorer 18 cents, light rail 39 cents, bus transit 81 cents, modern streetcar 51 cents, trolley bus $1, etc. So it kind of varies. But operating costs of cars are actually quite a bit lower than rail per passenger mile. But there's more than just operating costs. So there's external costs. So he talks about there's a number of different external costs he looks at. But basically, this is how much externality is there, and this does not include capital costs of the actual pavement or the actual rail, and it also does not include carbon emissions
Yeah,
as an
yeah,
externality.
it wouldn't include that. Yeah.
So it talks about there's a little he talks about the methodology, but basically when you look at the actual externalities, there you see the opposite, where light rail is basically 0.4 cents per passenger mile of externalities, and then the Ford Explorer is up to 49 cents per passenger mile of externalities. So
Ah,
so driving has a lot more impact on essentially other people in terms of cost. Full external costs include cost of parking infrastructure, road facilities, land value, land use impacts, congestion, traffic services, transport diversity, and barrier effects. But it does not include air pollution, greenhouse gases, noise, water pollution, or waste. Basic external costs include only parking infrastructure, road facilities, land value and resource externalities, etc. And then there's a new
these
graph.
are all 2009 numbers
It is
too, by
old,
the way.
yeah, but I think the basic
Yeah,
concepts still kind of stand.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then if you include the total capital cost per passenger mile, so that would be an amortized cost of the infrastructure of the road or the rails or whatever, then it changes things a little bit. So diesel bus is actually one of the lowest in terms
Huh.
of the capital cost plus external costs. So if you add those two together, diesel bus is 31 cents, the Ford Explorer is $1.02, and then light rail is $1.27, and then bus transit is $1.12. So that's kind of interesting.
Hmm.
And then if you go down to this is page 4 of the notes. So it looks at total cost per passenger mile of capital operating and full external costs plus present day energy cost and future increase in energy cost. So I believe energy cost is probably both of these figures show the cost that is currently spent on energy for each mode, as well as the future increase in energy costs that can be expected as non renewable fuels become more scarce. So I believe what this means is that the operating cost did not include the cost of fuel. It was mostly the cost of, maintenance, paying the sort of drivers, etc. But if you,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
so if you include the
Okay.
energy
Well, no
costs,
wonder they're so low.
yeah,
Yeah, for the cars.
yeah. So
Yeah.
if you include the energy costs, so Ford Explorer is about $1.54, light rail is about $1.68, diesel bus is about $1.62. So honestly, like they're kind of pretty similar in terms of actual cost of operation for passenger mile. So in terms of actual like how much does it actually cost to operate these different services, they all kind of come to the similar, relatively similar amount. And then this is per passenger mile though, but some modes of transit are for shorter trips. And so if you look at cost per trip, then streetcars become very very cheap. It's $3 per trip, and then things like the Ford Explorer goes up to $12.30 per trip. So that's total cost per trip, full
Huh.
external costs excluding pollution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So here, it says the transportation modes encouraging land use that support shorter trips, like trolley bus and modern tram, are significantly more cost effective than those that facilitate more spread out land use patterns. So I'm going to be honest, the $12 figure sounds kind of high.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah, that
know.
is high.
Yeah, I don't know how he calculated the trip distance. But I guess the point is when it comes to actual costs, if you include externalities, and the caveat being this guy did not include things like pollution, noise, carbon emissions, etc. But he was mostly focused on like land use and facilities and stuff. Um, they're mostly they're not as different from each other as I expected. I guess the key thing is that driving has more externalities, whereas with rail, less of the cost is externalized to other people.
Well, there's a lot of work that goes into just roads and maintaining roads for cars.
Rail is also quite expensive to maintain,
Yeah.
I think.
But there's usually way less rail than there are roads.
Don't you mean there's more
Because there's
roads than
always the
rail?
assumption, well, because there's always the assumption that you're going to walk the last like half mile or so.
Of rail?
Oh, like if you're going somewhere on a rail,
Right.
then like what are the odds that like you're going to like end up like you don't need a station right where you're going. You just
Yeah.
need to get within about a half mile of the place.
Yeah, that's true. I think though, yeah, I think actually per mile, I'm pretty sure, I'm almost positive paved roads are cheaper as a capital expense. Per mile, it's cheaper to maintain roads than it is to maintain rail. But like you said, there's fewer miles of rail for a given city than miles
Yeah.
of road. So, anyways, in terms of other externalities, so I made a chart. When it comes to deaths per 100 billion passenger miles, so flying, there's about one death per 100 billion passenger mile. High speed rail,
Super low.
high speed, heavy, and light rail. I think there was a single metric for rail, and so it's about 30 billion, or excuse me, 30 deaths per 100 billion passenger miles. Bus was at 4, cars was at 540. Cycling was at 7,900, and then walking was
Wow.
and then walking was at 237. So
Yeah, but cycling and walking usually is from an impact with a car.
yeah, yeah, and it's also depends a lot on urban design. So there's tangible ways you can make cycling and walking much safer as a urban planner or as a policy person.
Shouldn't we round this up for the larger vehicle is responsible for that death?
I mean, debatable,
So
perhaps.
the cars would take in the cycling, and then I don't know what would happen if a plane ran into a high speed rail. Who would take the fault for that one? Probably the plane.
But basically, flying is, if you're looking at per mile or per passenger mile, it is very, very safe. It changes a little bit when you look at per trip, just because, if you're flying across the country, that's
You're doing way more miles.
yeah, way more miles. So if you're looking like, is it safer to fly across the country, or is it safer to like, drive down the street to like buy like a snack at 7-Eleven? Obviously, each trip driving to 7-Eleven, you're probably going to be fine. But when you actually start looking
Yeah.
at passenger miles, then flying is clearly by far the safest option. Bus is 4 times deadlier than flying, and then rail is about 7 times deadlier than bus, and then cars are a little over 10 times more dangerous than rail, and then walking is about half as deadly as cars, and then cycling is over 10 times deadlier than driving. So when you start to look at fatalities, then you see massive benefits in rail and bus over cars. Substantial benefit. Cycling, though, is very, very dangerous. And I think most
Yeah,
cyclists
looks like
are
it.
well aware of this. It's just not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's why they are very passionate about having bike lanes.
Yeah. And that's the issue is like a lot of cities, most cities arguably, they don't have bike lanes. And so cyclists have to share the roads with cars basically. Whereas,
Honestly, I've looked into biking to work from where I'm at right now, and I can do most of it on bike lanes. But this last stretch that goes through the city with like almost no bike lanes, I just thought about it and said, no, if I do that enough, I've like really increased the risk of dying.
yeah. And I used to live in a city where I rode my bike around a lot. And like, even while I was doing it, I'm like, man, this is
Yeah,
dangerous.
it just feels like you're risking it.
Yeah. Which sucks. You know, it's too bad because cycling's great.
Yeah.
It's good for you. It's healthy. It's a great mode of transportation. Um,
Yeah, it's 100% sharing the road with the cars, though.
in terms
Like, if you run into another walker or a biker, like, you might break something, but you're not going to die.
in terms of noise as an externality, I mean, there's no obvious metrics, but clearly cycling and walking are a lot quieter than other modes. I think that's pretty obvious. When it comes to carbon emissions, so the lowest are rail. So light rail is at 29 grams per passenger kilometer. That's grams of carbon dioxide. Light rail is at 29, heavy rail is at 35. Bus varies from 27 to 97. Cars, it's about 47 for EVs and 170 for internal combustion cars. High speed rail is 5.7 to 10.4, so it's very very low. Flying is very high. It's 148 to
Yeah,
246. So flying is
that's the one thing against flying. Well, it doesn't, like, jets don't work unless it's propelling pollution backwards.
yeah. And then believe it or not, if you're eating a standard diet, cycling can use up to 140 grams of or emit up to 140 grams per passenger kilometer, and then walking up to
That's
260.
that's what I'm looking at. So it's like more than rail
Yes.
and buses.
Yeah.
Huh.
Well, because if you think about it, when you're walking, you're expending energy that you consumed through food. And think of all the resources used to make that food. Um, Meat especially is very, very intensive in terms of resources. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. The
Hmm.
caveat here again is it's trips versus miles. So if you are in a very dense walkable area, one trip could literally be like, a couple hundred yards at most,
Yeah.
and so that kind of changes the calculus a little bit.
Yeah.
In terms of
That is funny that it's more for walking and biking, but yeah,
not intuitive.
that's not intuitive, but that's carbon grams you should expend anyway at some point.
Yeah, I would say so. I'm just imagining someone refusing to exercise because they care about the environment.
There has to be a Wojak for that.
In terms of congestion, again, not easy to measure, but I think it's pretty obvious that cars. So ignore that column because I filled it in wrong. But congestion can
Yeah,
get
I see that.
yeah
I'm like, how is cars
yeah. So cars
low?
clearly cars make congestion a lot worse because they're a
Yeah.
less dense mode of transit. In terms of time, like how quickly to get from point A to B, again, flying and high speed rail is much faster for long distances. Cycling and walking are very slow. So, if you're going long distances, it's not very efficient. In terms of comfort, I think it's pretty obvious flying is not very comfortable. Buses, if there's like strange characters on the bus, it can be quite uncomfortable. Cycling and walking, if weather's an issue, then it can be quite uncomfortable. So it's kind of subjective, but those are a few things to look at as well. All right, that was episode 1 of our episode on transportation. We'll do episode 2 next.